The River Dee estuary straddles the border between England and Wales. It is home to an extensive salt marsh. The salt marsh is 6 miles long and at its widest point extends over 2 miles into the river. 100 years ago, this marsh didn't exist, and the Dee was a busy river, used by small commercial vessels and fishing boats. The arrival of the first signs of the salt marsh in the early 20th century wasn't a natural occurrence. It was the direct consequence of human activity. The deliberate planting of the hybrid plant, Spartina anglica. Spartina anglica originated in about 1870, when native European cordgrass interbred with American cordgrass. The American cordgrass had found its way to southern England in ships' ballast tanks. At first, Spartina anglica was seen as a valuable new plant species for controlling the erosion of tidal riverbanks, and it was widely planted throughout the British Isles. In the 1920s, Spartina was used to strengthen the banks of a section of the River Dee, 8 miles downstream from Chester. What wasn't realised at the time was that seeds of Spartina and small breakaway rafts of the plant would be carried onto the tidal mudflats of the wider estuary, and Spartina soon began to colonise areas where it was never intended to be. Spartina is very good at spreading through its root system, the property that made it so useful for strengthening riverbanks. However, on the open mudflats, the Spartina spread rapidly, trapping more sediment. Over time, the sediment surface rose and the habitat became more terrestrial, allowing plants to take root less tolerant of salt water. Plants like reeds and small trees that are usually only found on dry land. A substantial part of the English side of the estuary has now been swallowed up by the advancing salt marsh. Like here, for example, where, up until the end of the 19th century, coal from a nearby mine was loaded onto barges at this quay. There used to be a wide tidal channel that ships and barges could navigate, but that has long since vanished. And now all that remains are the abandoned stones, half sunk in the ground. Very occasionally, the tide will be high enough to reach the old quay, an event that brings out the bird watchers with their telescopes and cameras. The salt marsh is a haven for wading and migratory birds, and they take to the air in their thousands when their habitat is disturbed by the rising water. The salt marsh is intersected by gutters, like veins of a leaf, through which water draining from the land escapes to the sea. These gutters are the ghosts of the channels that 100 years ago threaded their way through the mudflats and sandbanks at low tide. Most of the gutters are narrow and not navigable, but nearer to the mouth of the estuary, a relatively wide steep-sided gutter provides a grim anchorage for the few remaining seaworthy boats, surrounded by abandoned boats rotting away on the higher parts of the salt marsh. A boat graveyard in a place that was once where fishing boats could be drawn up on a sandy beach. The most remarkable casualty of the salt marsh's appetite for destroying ways of life can be found at Park Gate. Park Gate was once a thriving port and famous for cockle fishing. But now the tide rarely touches the stones of the promenade wall. But see what happens when the sea does return to Park Gate. There is a spectacular show from the wild birds that have made the Marshland their home. The Dee Estuary Salt Marsh is internationally recognised as a wildlife habitat and is designated as a UK Site of Special Scientific Interest. There is an uneasy relationship between the local wildfowlers who have permission to shoot ducks in designated areas and the custodians, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. Wildfowlers are probably the only humans who know the terrain well enough to venture out to the far edge of the marsh. A hunter will set off before it gets light to walk to his preferred spot. Here he will dig a shallow hole to hide in. Then he patiently waits for dawn and a rising tide. The rising water chases the ducks into the air within range of the hunter's shotgun. His dog will retrieve the kill. This is usually only one duck, 2 if he's very lucky. Then comes a long trek back across the marsh. There are deep gutters to negotiate, so a straight path back to the shore isn't possible. When this man eventually reaches me, he tells me the marsh is still growing, inching its way northwards towards the mouth of the estuary and westwards towards the main river channel. The River Dee estuary is 6 miles wide where it meets the Irish Sea. Marking this point on the English side is Hilbre Island, an island that can be reached on foot at low tide. This part of the estuary is several miles from the advancing front edge of the salt marsh. However, Spartina grass has the habit of appearing in unexpected places, far beyond where the main growth area is. And there's a well-established patch of grass on the shore directly opposite the island. Not quite a salt marsh as such, but heading that way. Spartina grass has appeared as if from nowhere round the corner at Hoylake on the Irish Sea coast, a place you would have thought was well out of reach of the invading grass. 9 years ago, this view looked very different. But seeds of Spartina from the estuary have been washed up onto the beach by the rising tides, and the falling tides have failed to carry all the seeds away. The seeds that remained were able to take root, and small patches of the grass appeared. The local council had a policy of digging out the clumps of grass, or poisoning it with chemicals, but this was abandoned in 2019. It was concluded that trying to stop the spread of Spartina was as futile as King Canute's gesture to hold back the sea. As the foreshore began to take on the makings of a salt marsh, the opinion of the local community was polarised between those who believed the presence of the salt marsh would be good for wildlife and those who wanted their sandy beach returned. In early 2024, a new plan was announced, a compromise where some areas of the invasive grass would be dug out and other areas would be left to develop naturally. But whether this will be seen as a win for either side is questionable. Plus, there's the other question. of whether it's actually possible to stop the spread of what many people believe to be the unstoppable Spartina grass. I doubt if anyone can predict with any certainty what the future holds for the River Dee estuary and beyond, other than the marshland will continue to expand. The Spartina grass at Hoylake may one day join up with that in the estuary, creating another area that will become a haven for wildlife. I find it fascinating that what began as the well-intentioned action in the 1920s of planting Spartina anglica to strengthen the banks of the river channel resulted in such monumental unforeseen consequences. This demonstrates how forceful nature can be when it turns against the best laid schemes of humankind.